I wanted to ask you about climate change. Secretary Perry, at your confirmation hearing, you acknowledged that the climate is changing. But on Monday, you were asked on CNBC, do you believe CO2 is the primary control knob for the temperature of the Earth and for climate? And you answered no. So if the climate is changing and if you disagree that CO2 is the primary driver, what do you think is driving the change?
Yes, sir. And I'll finish the rest of that interview for the public that may, excuse me, that may have not gotten as much coverage as me saying that I did not think that CO2 was the primary knob that changes it. I don't. I think there are some other naturally occurring events, the warming and the cooling of our ocean waters and some other activities that occur. I also said in the next breath that man's impact does in fact have an impact on the climate, and the question is, what is going to be the economic impact for this country? And I referred yesterday to in a hearing in front of the Appropriations, Senate Appropriations, that even an individual as celebrated from the standpoint of his capabilities, the Undersecretary of Energy under the previous administration, Stephen Coons, he said that the science isn't settled yet. And I asked the committee, and I'll ask you, don't you think it's okay to have this conversation about the science of climate change? And why don't we have a red team approach and sit down, get the politicians out of the room and let the scientists and listen to what they have to say about it. I'm pretty comfortable that what's wrong with being a skeptic, I think, is about something that we're talking about that's going to have a massive impact on the American economy.
Well, you said this thing about, you told Senator Coons that we need a red team, blue team exercise to establish climate change. It's my understanding that in a red team, blue team exercise, the blue team makes an argument, then a red team tries to knock it down. And the blue team then refines their argument, and they go back and forth until consensus is reached. But that's exactly how science works, including climate science. Researchers collect data and make arguments. Peer reviewers poke holes in the argument. The researchers respond, and it goes back and forth until consensus is reached. Every peer-reviewed climate study goes through that red team, blue team treatment, and then thousands of studies are gathered into reports, and those reports themselves go through rigorous red team, blue team, and that's the scientific process. And you're not the first to do red team, blue team. The Koch brothers hired a red team of skeptics in 2012 in an effort to cast doubt on mainstream science. It was called the BEST Project, and much to the chagrin of their funders, the skeptical scientists found that mainstream climate science is correct. To quote the scientific director of BEST, Dr. Richard Muller, "Call me a converted skeptic." This is in 2013 or 14. Last year, following an intensive research effort involving a dozen scientists, I concluded that global warming was real and that the prior estimates of the rate of warming were correct. And I'm now going a step further. Humans are entirely the cause. Now, if you say that this is caused by the warming of the oceans, the reason the oceans are warming is because they absorb the heat. That's why sea level is rising, because when the water heats, it expands, and also because of the melting of the ice caps. This is not, there's no peer-reviewed study that doesn't say this is happening. And the biggest proponent of this is our military. And they, in their quadrennial review, say this is the biggest threat to our world. The time for red team, I'm sorry, that's what we do every day. That's what scientists do every day. And 100% of peer-reviewed scientists have a consensus, and that is that this is happening. At the House Appropriations hearing last week, you had an exchange on climate change with my Minnesota colleague, Representative Betty McCollum. You talked about glacial retreat in Glacier National Park, saying, quote, glaciers started melting in Glacier Park right after the end of the last ice age. That is true, but you continued, it has been a consistent melt. In fact, data released last month by the U.S. Geological Survey scientists who work for you show that glaciers in the park have shrunk by 40% in just the last 50 years. So we are not seeing a consistent melt, where melting is dramatically accelerating. I am concerned that our Secretary of the Interior, who's in charge of our nation's public lands, is unclear, and we had this in your confirmation hearing. I'm concerned about whether you are clear about the magnitude of warming that is occurring, and the backing out of the Paris Agreement. I know I'm running out of time. Can you tell me how much warming government scientists predict for the end of this century under a business as usual scenario?
Well, the Paris Accord, in the President and my judgment, it wasn't about climate change, it was about a bad deal. We spent $3 billion, $1 billion in cash.
Let me just, I know we're out of time, so can you just answer my question? Can you tell me how much warming government scientists predict for the end of this century under a business as usual scenario?
I don't think the government scientists can predict with certainty. There isn't a model that exists today that can predict today's weather, given all the data.
Well, they predict a range, and you said we have to go with the science. That's what you said during the early part of this hearing. You said we have to go with the science. And there is agreement among climate scientists about the range of what we would have in warming by the end of the century. Do you know what that range is?
If everyone adhered to the Paris Climate Accord, that change would be roughly 0.2 degrees, which is insignificant. And yet, people ignore the fact that China... No. That was an MIT study. We can give you...
That was what the change would be under the period covered by the agreement. That's not what the change would be in the end of the century if they continued it. So you're really mixing apples and oranges. I just want you to answer the question that I asked you. That's all I want you to do. Can you tell me how much warming government scientists working for our government predict for the end of the century under a business as usual scenario?
Can you tell me, sir, whether or not China increased its CO2 between now and 2030 on the agreement? And by what? But I will be glad to give you that answer.
And that answer is?
I will be glad to give you that answer.
So you'll give it in writing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Madam President, I rise today to join my colleagues to expose those who continue to deny the science of climate change and try to deceive the American people. This is important because climate change is an existential threat to our planet and to future generations. By denying climate science and lobbying against efforts to address climate change, these deniers are subjecting the planet and everybody on it to great risk. Climate change will have significant adverse impacts on all of our states, including my state of Minnesota. Just look at our agriculture sector, which is responsible for 1 out of every 5 jobs in Minnesota. Warmer temperatures and more intense droughts are going to negatively impact this important rural economic engine. In fact, a recent study estimates that with no adaptation efforts against climate change, Midwest crop production could decrease by more than 60% by the end of the century. Climate change will also impact our waters, and that is important to my state, the land of 10,000 lakes, which includes Lake Superior. Lake Superior alone contains about 10% of the world's fresh surface water, and it is warming by 2 degrees per decade. Because of this warming, we are seeing more evaporation and lower water levels in the lake. Plus, rising temperatures allow for more favorable conditions for invasive species and hazardous algal blooms. Warmer temperatures could also have severe consequences for fish like walleye pike and trout that are so important to Minnesota fisheries and ecosystems. And let's not forget the threat of climate change to our forests. Like in our lakes, warmer temperatures elevate the threat of invasive species such as the emerald ash borer and gypsy moth that are rapidly changing the composition of our forests, or the bark beetle in Colorado, where the presiding officer represents, which destroy trees and cost economies money and jobs.